Welcome back to the SpiritVox. I am your host, and tonight we are not doing just one story. Tonight we are going deep. 5 stories. 5 real accounts submitted by people who lived through something they cannot explain and cannot forget. Some of these stories were sent to us by listeners. Some were collected directly from the people involved. All of them are disturbing.
All of them are real. Turn off your lights if you want. Lock your doors. And whatever you do not listen to this alone at midnight. You have been warned. Let us begin.
The SpiritVox, it's alive.
There's a kind of man who spends his whole life fighting darkness on behalf of other people. He drives it out of homes. He quiets things that should not be moving. He gives frightened families their peace back. And for a long time he believes that makes him untouchable. This is the story of a man named Harold Fraser, a faith healer, a protector, a man whose pride opened a door that no prayer could fully close again. Harold Fraser grew up in a small town in rural Kentucky. His grandfather was a lay minister and a folk healer, a quiet, serious man who could walk into a house that had been making its family miserable for years and walk out an hour later, leaving nothing behind but peace. Harold had watched him work since childhood. He had absorbed every technique, every scripture, every ritual, and when his grandfather passed, Harold carried it all forward. By the time Harold was in his late 50s, he had a reputation that spread across multiple counties. People called him when their kids started screaming at things on the ceiling. They called him when their livestock died in patterns that made no sense. They called him when they felt something standing in the corner of the room that no one else could see. Harold always showed up, and Harold almost always succeeded. The problem was that Harold knew it. His wife Linda had noticed the change years before anything bad happened. The way Harold talked at dinner, the way he ranked his own cases like trophies, the way he had started dismissing situations before he fully understood them. Because nothing had beaten him yet, and he had quietly stopped believing anything could. He had no formal training, no seminary degree, no certification of any kind. Just his grandfather's knowledge, his own years of experience, and a growing, dangerous certainty that he was something more than an ordinary man. Then came the Tuesday afternoon in late October when a man named Daniel Marsh knocked on the door of the small community church where Harold volunteered. Daniel looked terrible, hollowed out, like a man who had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in months. He twisted a baseball cap in both hands and told Harold about his son, a 15-year-old boy named Eli who had stopped sleeping almost entirely, who spoke in strange languages no one in the family had ever heard before, not just words but full sentences, spoken in a flat and toneless voice that didn't sound like a teenager at all, who whispered in the night about doors and arrivals and things coming through,
Who had, on at least 3 occasions that Daniel could confirm, been seen by 2 different people in 2 completely separate locations at exactly the same moment.
Harold felt something shift in his chest when he heard that last part. Not fear exactly, more like the particular tightening that comes before something large and uncertain. He had read about cases like this. He had studied them in the old notes his grandfather had left behind, written in the margins of worn paperback Bibles. He had never personally handled one, but instead of saying that, Harold told Daniel he would come by that evening. The Marsh property sat at the end of a gravel road about 20 minutes outside of town. Harold pulled up just after sunset. The house was a two-story white farmhouse, ordinary looking, with a single porch light burning yellow in the early dark. Nothing about it looked wrong from the outside, but Harold sat in his truck for a full minute before getting out.
There was a feeling in the air around the property. Not a smell exactly, more like pressure, like the atmosphere just before a storm breaks. He ignored it and went inside.
Daniel met him in the hallway and lowered his voice to tell Harold something important before they went any further. 6 other men had already tried to help Eli. 3 pastors, a deacon from a church 40 miles away, and 2 people with backgrounds very similar to Harold's own. Every single one of them had left after meeting the boy and refused to continue.
When Daniel had called them afterward to ask why, most of them had apologized quietly and said only that the situation was beyond what they were equipped to handle.
Harold nodded and walked into the living room. Eli was sitting in an armchair near the window. He was a lean, pale teenager with dark circles under his eyes so severe they looked like old bruising. The room was dim. The television was off. The boy was completely still, hands folded in his lap, and he was watching the doorway as though he had known Harold was coming. When Harold stepped in, Eli smiled. It was a slow and careful smile that looked like something performing the idea of a smile rather than actually feeling one. He said in a perfectly calm voice, "How many are you?" Harold assumed he meant how many cases. He said he had lost count over the years. Eli nodded like that was the answer he expected. "Then," he said, "I have many names myself. Across many years and many places, people have called me different things." He paused. He said, "You already know me. You just don't remember yet." Harold didn't answer. He closed his eyes and began to pray silently, running through the words he had used hundreds of times before. Eli reached across the space between them and grabbed his wrist and said, "Stop that." Harold had not spoken. He had not moved his lips. There was no way for the boy to know. And yet he had known immediately, before Harold had finished the first line. Harold pulled his arm back. He kept his voice level. He kept praying. Eli leaned forward and said in a quieter voice that Harold didn't have to fight. He said there was an easier path. He said that if Harold simply stopped sleeping just for 7 days, he would begin to understand. He said the dark never sleeps. That's why the dark always wins. He said Harold could be on the right side of that equation if he chose. Harold pressed on. He reached forward and took Eli's hand firmly and continued. The boy went rigid. Then he lunged fast and sudden and sank his teeth into Harold's ear hard enough to draw blood. Harold shoved back in pain, released the boy, and stepped out of the room. He stood in the hallway with his hand pressed against the side of his head and made himself breathe slowly. He found Daniel in the kitchen and asked how long this had been going on. Daniel said 4 months. Harold said goodnight and drove home. On the road back, his headlights swept across something in the lane ahead, a large snake moving slowly across the gravel, then stopping and turning its head to look directly at the truck for a long moment before slipping off into the dark field. Harold told himself it was nothing. He got home to a phone call from his younger brother, 2 states away. A fire had started in the old family barn. 2 horses were dead. And while Harold was still on the phone processing that, his son came through the front door limping, hit from behind by a car pulling out of a parking lot, the wheel having gone across the top of his foot. Harold sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that. He told himself it was coincidence. He almost believed it. What those 2 incidents actually were, Harold would understand much later, was a warning. A clear and deliberate message. Stay away from the marsh boy. Leave this case alone. Walk away and your family stays safe. Harold did not walk away. He sat at that kitchen table and felt something else growing inside him alongside the shock, anger, and beneath the anger the worst possible thing. Wounded pride. He was Harold Fraser. He had been doing this work for 30 years. He was not going to be pushed off a case by whatever had taken hold of a 15-year-old in a farmhouse outside of town. He spent 2 days preparing. He called an old contact of his grandfather's, a man in his 80s named Everett, who had been doing this kind of work even longer than Harold, and who knew things Harold had never learned. Everett listened to the whole story, and then went quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, he said only, "Harold, this one is a long way out from anything you've handled before. Let it go." Harold thanked him for his time and hung up. He went back to the Marsh house on a Thursday evening with a bag full of supplies and a head full of certainty. He went directly into Eli's room without stopping to talk to Daniel. He didn't speak to the boy. He simply sat down, opened his bag, and began. Eli watched him with that same slow, patient smile. He started talking, trying different angles to break Harold's concentration, mocking, threatening, flattering. He shifted through all of it like someone cycling through radio stations, looking for the frequency that would cause Harold to lose his place. Harold held firm. For almost 20 minutes he held firm. And then Eli went completely still and leaned in close to Harold's ear and whispered very quietly that Harold's son was still limping, that Harold's brother had not finished grieving his horses, that these were just the beginning, that there were other people Harold loved, and that every one of them was reachable. Harold's hand shot out and closed around the boy's throat before he made a conscious decision to do it. He demanded answers. He demanded to know what this thing was and what it wanted and why it had gone after his family. The room changed. The temperature dropped. The walls seemed to flex slightly in and out, like the house was breathing. Harold let go and forced himself back into scripture, voice raised now, not calm anymore, not controlled. Eli collapsed sideways onto the floor and began cursing Harold in a voice that barely sounded human anymore, promising specific things, describing what it would do to Harold's wife, his son, his brother. Then Daniel burst into the room. He had heard the noise from downstairs. He grabbed Harold from behind, covered his mouth with one hand, and pulled him backward, shouting at him that he had come here to help, not to kill his son. Harold tried to explain. Daniel wouldn't hear it. He told Harold to get out of his house. Harold gathered his bag in silence and left. As he walked down the front porch steps, he heard Eli's voice from the upstairs window, flat and pleasant, saying that Harold would feel the results of tonight's visit very soon. Harold drove home without answering his phone. Daniel called 4 times. Harold didn't pick up once. He was too angry, too humiliated. He had been thrown out. He had gone in without full preparation, without backup, without proper support, and he had let his emotions take over. His grandfather would have been ashamed. He did not know yet that this was only the beginning. The first incident happened 3 days later, on a warm afternoon. Harold's house was a 2-story brick colonial with a covered back porch that stayed shaded through most of the day. Linda's sister Carol had come by to help with some sewing, and the 2 women had been working in the kitchen all afternoon. Harold had been dozing on the back porch, drowsy in the heat, half asleep in the afternoon quiet. Linda came out to call him inside. He got up, closed the porch door behind him, and went to the bedroom to wash his face. He was in the hallway when he heard a knock at the back door. He and Linda both turned. Through the glass panel beside the door they could see Carol standing on the back porch, smiling at them in an odd, wide way, asking to be let in. She said she had some things to finish up and had stepped outside for a moment. Could they open up? Harold and Linda stood completely still. Carol had left through the front door while Harold was walking in from the porch. She had said goodbye to both of them. She had walked to her car. They had heard the engine. She had been gone for at least 5 minutes before the knock came at the back door. The back porch was on the second floor. There was no external staircase. There was no way up. And yet Carol stood there 3 stories off the ground, with that wide, slow smile that Harold recognized from Eli's living room. Linda screamed. The figure outside tilted its head slightly, the smile still fixed, and then pushed 1 foot forward through the closed glass door, the leg passing through solid material like it wasn't there at all, and Linda fainted dead away. Harold stood alone in the hallway, unable to speak, unable to move, watching the door. After a moment, everything went back to normal. The porch was empty. The glass was solid. The afternoon light came through the window like nothing had happened. He spent an hour getting Linda calmed down and coherent. He called his son and daughter in from their rooms and asked if they had heard anything. His son said he had been coming down the hallway when he heard his father's voice telling him to go back to his room, that his mom had just been frightened by a bug, nothing serious. Harold had not been in the hallway. He had been on the porch. He had never said those words. Something had used his face and his voice to keep his children out of the room. What followed over the next several weeks was a sustained campaign of psychological destruction. Harold woke one morning before dawn to walk to the church for early prayers. The power on his street had gone out overnight. The road was completely dark. As he stepped off his front porch, a figure appeared beside him, an older man in a long coat carrying what appeared to be an old-fashioned lantern, its light throwing a small warm circle onto the pavement. The man said nothing. He simply walked alongside Harold, the lantern lighting the way. At the church gate, the figure stopped. Harold turned to thank him, and the man looked at him and said, without any preamble, that he had made sure Harold arrived safely tonight. He said that if Harold had walked to church alone in the dark and stumbled or been frightened, Harold would have called out to God in distress, and God answering, Harold thought, would have meant some portion of Harold's history being forgiven. The figure said that was the last thing it wanted. It said it was much easier to destroy a man whose prayers went through smoothly, because a man like that stops making them with urgency. Then it turned and walked away into the darkness, and the lantern went with it. Harold stood at the church gate for a long time in the dark. He understood then the mechanism of what was happening to him. It was not brute force, it was architecture. The thing that had come home with him from the Marsh house was systematically removing every reason Harold had to genuinely call out for help. It made sure nothing bad enough happened to break his pride completely. It kept him just functional enough to feel like he was managing, and all the while it was doing something to his memory, his concentration, his sense of what was real. His hair was falling out, his teeth ached constantly. The skin of his lips cracked and bled. He could not remember conversations he had been part of hours earlier. He forgot scripture he had known by heart for decades. Then one night Linda was away at her mother's house attending a family matter, and Harold was alone in the bedroom when the mattress shifted underneath him in a way that mattresses do not shift. A sound came from beneath the bed. He got up and turned on the light, and it flickered and died. He went to the switch by the door, and that one didn't work either. He stood in the dark and heard a voice very close to him saying over and over, "This way, this way, this way." He felt the room change around him in a way he could not describe later to anyone. like the floor dropped slightly, like the walls rearranged while he wasn't looking. He turned toward where he thought the door was and screamed. He woke on the floor with his hands and feet twisted at wrong angles, his face frozen in a wide, horrible grin, his eyes rolled back. That was how his son found him, having heard the scream from his own bedroom and run in. His son stood in the doorway, unable to approach, watching his father's body jerk and twitch slowly, while Harold's eyes remained fixed open, rolling, seeing something his son could not see. It was Harold's son who called an old family friend from their church, a man named Raymond Webb, who had known Harold for 30 years and who had, unknown to Harold, been watching his friend's deterioration with deep concern for months. Raymond arrived within 20 minutes. He brought 2 men from their congregation with him. Together the 3 of them worked over Harold for hours, until finally, toward dawn, Harold went still and quiet, and his eyes closed and he breathed normally. When Harold was coherent enough to talk, Raymond sat with him for a long time in the kitchen and listened to the full account from the beginning. Harold told him everything, including the pride, including ignoring the warnings, including grabbing Eli by the throat. Raymond was quiet for a long time. Then he asked Harold about something specific. Years earlier, Harold had told a story at a dinner gathering, laughing as he told it, about a particular case where a spirit had been trapped and subdued, and Harold had said something triumphant to it, something along the lines of "Nobody is coming to save you today." He had used the name of God in that sentence in a way that implied Harold himself was in God's place, judging and condemning. Harold had laughed telling it. The table had laughed. Raymond had not laughed. He remembered that dinner clearly. Harold sat with that for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. Raymond told him what he believed had happened. Harold had, over years of successful work, cultivated an arrangement with something he believed was a helpful spiritual entity, a force that assisted his healing work. He had never examined that arrangement carefully. He had never asked what it actually was or what it actually wanted. He had only known that it helped him succeed, and success had felt like proof enough. When Harold had encountered Eli and the thing inside Eli, the thing inside Eli had recognized Harold's assistant immediately. They were, Raymond believed, connected in some way, and the arrangement Harold had relied on without questioning had quietly dissolved. His assistant had switched sides, or perhaps had always been on the wrong side, and Harold had simply never looked closely enough to see it. The thing that had followed Harold home from the Marsh house was not a new enemy. It was something Harold had invited in himself years ago, with his eyes open. The physical deterioration, the memory loss, the appearances, the voice whispering directions in the dark. It was all a single coordinated effort to isolate Harold completely, to make him forget God by giving him no reason to cry out for help, to keep him just stable enough that his family didn't panic and seek outside assistance, and to do this until Harold was entirely hollowed out and then take whatever it wanted from what remained. The thing had come very close to succeeding. Raymond and his 2 companions spent the better part of a week at Harold's house. Harold was present for all of it, but mostly sitting in the corner of the room, quieter than anyone who knew him had ever seen him. At one point during the 3rd day, a voice came from the guest bedroom where Raymond was working, and it was Harold's voice, clear and recognizable, calling out a specific concern, something personal and specific to Harold's relationship with Raymond that no one else in the house should have known. Raymond didn't stop his work. He had been expecting something like that.
On the fourth day, something moved through Harold's house in a way they all felt, but none of them could see. Furniture didn't move, nothing fell. But every person in the building felt a pressure sweep from the front of the house to the back, like a great weight passing through the rooms, and then out. After it was gone, Harold's daughter came to the doorway of the living room looking pale. She was 17. She had been present for none of the work the three men were doing. She had been staying in her room. She said she needed to tell them something. She had been keeping a secret for months. Her bedroom had been the place where the entity had been most active. She had thought she was dreaming. She had thought she was imagining things. She described what she had seen in her room in precise clinical detail, and as she spoke, Raymond's two companions exchanged a look over her head, because what she was describing matched things that were not generally known, things from old accounts that no teenager should have had access to. She had not been dreaming. The entity had been in her room consistently, for months, while her father worked and prayed and fought it in other parts of the house. It had not bothered her physically. It had simply lived there, in the corner by her window, watching, waiting. She had never told her father because she had been afraid of worrying him. She did not know that she had been a tool, that her room had been the staging ground, that her presence there had been the reason Harold had never been able to fully clear the house, because every time progress was made in one area, the source point stayed intact. Harold wept when he understood this. Real tears, not the wet eyes of a tired old man. Real grief. He had spent 30 years protecting other people's children, and the darkness had walked right past him, into his own daughter's bedroom, and he had never known. Raymond told Harold later that what had come for him was not unique. He had seen similar cases before, always involving people with genuine gifts who had, over time, stopped attributing their success to anything beyond themselves. The entity that attached itself to Harold was a specific kind, Raymond said, one that sought out people whose faith had become a performance rather than a reality, because performance faith has no power. It looks identical from the outside, it says the right words and does the right things, but it is hollow at the center, and hollow things can be entered. Harold recovered physically over the following months. His hair grew back, his memory returned. He went back to the small church and resumed his volunteering, but differently now. He stopped telling stories about his cases. He stopped keeping count. He began turning cases away again, the way his grandfather always had, saying honestly when something was beyond what he could manage. He never went back to the Marsh house. He was told through a mutual contact that Eli had eventually been helped by a team of 3 people working together. The boy recovered fully. Harold sent a note to Daniel Marsh with no explanation and no request for acknowledgement. It just said he was sorry for how he had handled things and that he wished the family well. Daniel never wrote back. Harold did not blame him. As for Harold's daughter, she was fine. Better than fine, Raymond said, because she had endured something in that corner of her room for months without breaking, without running, and without losing herself. She was tougher than anyone had known, including her. Some people come through darkness smaller than they went in. She came through larger. Harold said that was the only part of the story that gave him peace. Remember that? Pride is the door that darkness walks through, not the big dramatic kind of pride, the quiet, everyday kind, the kind that stops you asking for help, the kind that makes you stop looking at what's standing in the corner.
Most ghost stories begin with a house or a place, a location that has accumulated something dark over time, something that stays put and waits for whoever is unlucky enough to wander in. But some of them follow you. Some of them decide for their own reasons that you are the one they want. This story is about a young man named Marcus Webb, a college student from Ohio, who made one impulsive decision at a roadside shrine in rural Tennessee and spent the next 6 months paying for it. Marcus was 20 years old, a second-year student at a university in Columbus, Ohio, studying civil engineering. He was not particularly religious. He was not superstitious. He was practical and organized, and the kind of person who laughed a little too loudly at ghost stories because he genuinely thought they were silly. It was the summer after his first year of college. He had spent the first half of the summer working a desk job at his uncle's contracting firm, and when his semester exams were done and paid work was over, he decided to use the remaining weeks to do something useful with his faith. He had grown up attending church, loosely, and he knew people who went on mission trips and community service tours, and it seemed like the right time to try it. He signed on with a traveling Christian outreach group that spent summers driving through small towns in the American South, doing odd jobs for elderly residents and running informal prayer gatherings at small rural churches. He loaded a bag into a passenger van with 12 other volunteers and headed south. The group spent 3 weeks working their way through small communities in Tennessee and northern Georgia, painting porches, helping repair roofs, sitting with people who wanted someone to talk to. Marcus enjoyed most of it. He was not a particularly spiritual person, but the work was satisfying, and the people they met were genuine and grateful. Then one afternoon, the group stopped at a small rural community that had a large and very old property at its edge, partially overgrown, with a crumbling stone wall and several enormous oak trees, whose roots had buckled the surrounding ground over decades. At the back of this property, nearly hidden by undergrowth, was an old cemetery, and beside the cemetery, under the largest oak, a small informal shrine. It was the kind of shrine that rural southern communities sometimes built around a place or a tree that had been associated with something, a local legend, a death, a feeling. This one had red string tied around several of the lower branches of the oak. On the roots, balanced on small platforms made of packed earth, were ceramic plates covered with a tarp held down by stones. Beside the plates, several weathered glass jars. Marcus asked one of the local volunteers what the shrine was for. The man told him it was an old thing, not to worry about it, and walked away from the subject quickly. Marcus looked at the shrine for a moment. He picked up a large piece of broken brick from the path nearby. He threw it at one of the ceramic plates. It shattered. He felt a gust of warm air hit him across the back, immediate and forceful, even though the afternoon was completely still. The hairs on his arms stood up. He looked around. Nothing moved. Nothing made any sound. The local volunteer was staring at him from 20 feet away with an expression Marcus could not interpret. The man said nothing. He turned and walked away toward the main group. That evening, Marcus told himself it was just a strange breeze and forgot about it, or tried to. The group moved on 2 days later to a new location. They were now at a small rural school that was being used as a temporary community center, and the group was sleeping on cots in the gymnasium. It was a 2-story building. Their sleeping area was on the ground floor. A few nights in, Marcus woke at around 2 a.m. for no reason he could identify. He was simply awake, completely alert,
as though something had shaken him. He lay on his cot for a moment, then got up to use the bathroom at the end of the hall.
The hallway between the gym and the bathrooms was about 40 feet long, lit by 2 emergency exit signs at either end. As Marcus stepped into the hall and turned toward the bathroom, he saw, for just under a second, someone at the far end of the corridor. A human-shaped figure, standing completely still, and then simply not there.
Marcus stood in the hallway for a long moment. He went to the bathroom. He came back. He lay down on his cot and did not sleep again until sunrise. He told no one.
3 days later, the group was packing up to move again. Marcus was on the second floor gathering supplies from a storage room when he felt clearly and unmistakably warm breath on the back of his neck, and a voice, barely above a whisper, said, "How far do you think you'll get?"
He turned completely around. He was alone in the room. The door was closed. There was no one on the stairs outside. He stood in that room for a full minute with his back against the wall before he made himself open the door and go back downstairs. He said nothing to anyone.
The group returned to their home base, a church in a small city in northern Tennessee, and 2 days later, Marcus boarded a bus back to Ohio. He told himself that whatever strange things had happened on the road, they were behind him now. He was going home. It was over. It was not over. The first thing he noticed when he got back to his apartment in Columbus was that the place felt different. Not in any way he could point to. The furniture was in the right place. Nothing was missing. The air was normal. But it felt like the apartment had a slightly different quality to the silence than it had before, like a room feels when someone has recently left it. He ignored this for as long as he could, which was about 2 weeks. Then one night he came home from evening prayers at the campus chapel and walked into his apartment to find all the lights were off and his roommate was out. He felt around for the wall switch, found it, flicked it. Nothing. He tried the lamp by the door. Nothing. He assumed the circuit had tripped and went toward the kitchen to find the breaker box. Something grabbed him from behind with both arms and squeezed. Not hands exactly. More like 2 massive bands of pressure closing around his chest and upper arms simultaneously, pinning his arms to his sides. He could not take a full breath. He could not scream. He opened his mouth and nothing came out. He stood in the dark being held that way, unable to move, unable to call out, for what felt like several minutes. In his head, without making a decision to do it, he began saying a single phrase over and over, just a name, a prayer reduced to its simplest possible form, 2 words. He said them internally, not aloud, because he had no air. But with each repetition, the pressure lessened slightly. The bands around his chest eased a fraction. He said the 2 words faster without stopping, and the grip continued to loosen until finally it released entirely. He stood in the dark kitchen alone, gasping, feeling the air refill his lungs. In the corner of the room, something he could not quite see, a density in the dark that was slightly darker than the rest of it, began to laugh. A low sound, almost gentle, and it said, clearly and without hurry, that the next time Marcus lowered his guard, his family was going to watch him get carried out. Then it was gone. The lights came back on. The apartment was normal. Marcus sat on the kitchen floor for a long time. Marcus called a man from his home church the next morning, a man named Gerald, who had been his youth pastor when Marcus was in middle school, and who Marcus knew had experience with cases like this. Gerald listened to the whole story without interrupting. When Marcus finished, Gerald asked one question. He asked about the shrine. Marcus told him. Gerald said, "Okay, that's what we're dealing with then." Gerald drove up from Cleveland that same weekend. He arrived with a small bag and a worn Bible that looked like it had been through a great deal. He walked through Marcus's apartment slowly, room by room, not saying much. In the bedroom, he paused for a long time at the window. He looked at the corner where Marcus had described the figure. He nodded once, like confirming something he already suspected. Gerald sat Marcus down and explained what he believed had happened. The shrine Marcus had destroyed had been an old arrangement, he said, not a religious one in any traditional sense, more like a standing offer, a place where something kept its presence accessible to the local community in exchange for a certain kind of ongoing acknowledgement. When Marcus destroyed the plate, he had done something that disrupted that arrangement abruptly, and the thing that had kept the arrangement was not the kind of thing that simply moved on when it was inconvenienced. It followed the disruption to its source. The reason it had come all the way to Ohio, Gerald said, was not random. It was specific to Marcus. Because Marcus, unlike most people who might carelessly damage a shrine and walk away, was someone with genuine spiritual engagement, however inconsistent. Someone like that was worth following. Someone like that, broken down and emptied out, represented something useful. Gerald worked through the night. Marcus sat in the living room and tried to read and mostly just listened. At some point around 3 in the morning, he heard something in the bedroom that he could not identify. A series of sounds that he later described as 2 conversations happening in the same space at slightly different speeds. Then silence. Then Gerald came out and sat down and said it was done. Marcus asked what it had said. Gerald told him that it had said Marcus owed it something, that the plate that had been destroyed had contained a kind of food for it, and Marcus had taken that away. Gerald had told it that Marcus had not understood what he was doing, and that restitution would be made through other means. He would not tell Marcus what those means were. He said only that it was satisfied, and that Marcus needed to be more careful. Marcus asked what more careful meant. Gerald said it meant stop treating the things you cannot see as though they don't exist. It means being the same person in the dark as you are in the daylight. It means taking your faith seriously enough that something hostile would prefer to leave you alone rather than try its luck. Marcus never had another incident. He told this story to us years later, in a written account, asking that his real name not be used. He said he no longer laughs at ghost stories. He said that when he drives through rural areas and sees something unusual at a roadside, he does not throw things at it. He said that sounds obvious, but he wanted to say it anyway, for anyone who might need to hear it. This story was sent to us by a listener named Michael, who grew up in rural Louisiana. He asked us to tell it because it happened to his grandmother, a woman he describes as the toughest person he has ever known, and because the night it happened changed how his entire family thought about the hours between midnight and dawn. Michael's grandmother, a woman everyone in the family called Mamie, lived on a property in the bayou country of southern Louisiana that had been in the family for 3 generations. She was in her early 70s at the time of this story, partially disabled following an accident some years before, but deeply independent and deeply stubborn and absolutely unwilling to move into the main house with Michael's parents regardless of how often they asked. The property had several outbuildings. The main house where Michael's parents lived, a smaller cottage about 150 feet away where Mamie lived, a storage shed, an old smokehouse that hadn't been used in years, and at the back of the property, a large tupelo tree that had been there longer than anyone could remember, under which there had been a small cleared area for as long as any family member could recall, though no one alive remembered who had made it or why.
Michael's family were church-going people, Mamie more seriously than most. She had a specific nightly routine that she did not vary: prayers before bed, a small glass of water on the nightstand, the door locked and the windows latched.
One night in late summer, sometime after 9 o'clock, Mamie went to use the bathroom attached to her cottage. On her way back, she stepped outside for a moment, which she occasionally did to check the weather. She heard something drop from the direction of the tupelo tree, a heavy sound, like a large piece of fruit falling. She raised her lantern in that direction. Nothing visible. She turned to go back inside. Something wrapped around her ankle and lower leg. She looked down. In the lantern light, she could see it clearly. A snake, but wrong in a way that was hard to explain later, and that Michael says his grandmother struggled to describe for the rest of her life. It was very large, larger than any natural snake she had ever seen in those bayous, and its color in the lantern light was not quite a normal color, black in a way that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. She said it looked like a hole in the dark rather than a thing in the dark. It had her foot and lower calf and was beginning to tighten. She instinctively turned the lantern toward it, the way you do with snakes, the way the old knowledge says you do, the fire and the light. The snake convulsed and tightened harder. The lantern was in her hand and she moved it closer, and the thing lashed its tail sideways and knocked the lantern out of her grip with a force she said felt like a man's full arm swing. The lantern hit the base of the smokehouse and shattered. Michael's parents heard the explosion of breaking glass and came running from the main house. They found Mamie on the ground, unable to speak, something white at the corner of her mouth. The snake was gone. There was no physical injury on her leg. No bite, no bruise, no mark of any kind. They carried her inside. For the next several minutes, Mamie was unresponsive. Her eyes were open, but she was not reacting to anything around her. Michael's mother knelt beside her and began to pray quietly, the way she always did when she didn't know what else to do. Then Mommy's eyes shifted. Slowly, they moved to look directly at Michael's mother. And what Michael's mother saw in her own mother's face in that moment was not her mother. The face was her mother's face, but whatever was looking out through it was not. She could feel the difference the way you feel a room's temperature, immediately and without doubt.
Michael's father was already moving toward the door to get help. Michael's mother put her hand on Mamie's forehead and began to say a prayer of protection, a specific one she had learned years earlier from the old women of their church. The thing inside Mamie's body turned its attention to her fully, and it slapped her across the face hard enough to leave the clear outline of 4 fingers and a thumb on her cheek for 5 minutes. Michael's mother did not stop praying.
There was a man named Arthur who lived 3 miles down the road. Michael's family knew him well. He was a retired minister, elderly now. But in decades past, he had been known throughout the region for a specific kind of ministry, the kind that dealt with cases the regular churches preferred not to discuss openly. Michael's father had driven to Arthur's house before he was fully conscious of having decided to go there. He was knocking on Arthur's door at 20 minutes past 10 on a summer night without quite knowing how he had gotten there. Arthur opened the door already dressed. He had his Bible in his hand. He told Michael's father, before Michael's father had said a single word, that he knew. He said he would be there before them. He told Michael's father to go home and go in and lock the door and tell whoever was inside, in a calm, clear voice, that help was coming. He said not to argue with it, not to negotiate with it, just say it plainly, once, and then keep his wife praying. Michael's father drove home. Arthur walked. When Michael's father pulled into the property, he locked the car and went inside and said, in a calm voice, that help was on the way. The thing inside Mamie stopped moving. It fixed its eyes on the front door and did not look away. 3 minutes later, Arthur walked in through the front door. What followed is something Michael's father has refused to describe in detail in the 30 years since. He says only that Arthur worked for approximately 40 minutes. That at one point the thing inside Mamie spoke to Arthur in a very familiar way, as though it knew him personally. And Arthur replied in a tone that Michael's father described as the voice of someone who has had the same argument many times and is bored by it. That there is a point near the end where a sound came from outside the house, from the direction of the tupelo tree, a sound that Michael's father compares to a very large branch cracking, though nothing had fallen and there was no wind. After that, Mommy's eyes closed. When they opened again, she was herself. Arthur told the family before he left that the entity had come from the area near the old clearing under the tupelo tree, that it had been there a long time, and that it had been looking for a reason to come in for years. He told them to cut down the tree. He said it politely, but he said it as a fact, not a suggestion. The tree came down that weekend. The clearing was broken up and replanted with grass. Nothing unusual happened on the property after that. Mamie lived another 14 years. She never went outside after dark again without her Bible in her hand. Michael says that was the only thing about her that changed. Everything else, the stubbornness, the toughness, the refusal to move into the main house, stayed exactly the same until the day she died. Arthur walked home alone through 3 miles of dark Louisiana bayou country after midnight. Michael's father offered to drive him. Arthur declined. He said he was fine. He said he had walked this road many nights and nothing on it had ever given him any trouble. Michael believes him completely. Some things just want to be left alone. They have their space. They have their arrangement. They have been there a long time, and they expect a certain kind of consideration from the people who move through their territory. Most of the time people give it without knowing they're giving it. They just feel instinctively uncomfortable near certain trees or certain places, and they walk a different way and nothing happens. This is the story of 2 girls who didn't walk a different way, and what chose to follow one of them home because of it. It was the summer of 1989. 2 girls, best friends, ages 12 and 15, were spending a lazy July afternoon in the housing development where they both lived in Savannah, Georgia. The older girl was named Claire. The younger was named Donna, and she was Claire's cousin. They had been playing since morning, and by early afternoon, the heat had driven most of their friends back inside, and they were down to just the 2 of them. Claire wanted to go pick berries from a wild mulberry tree that grew at the edge of the older part of the development, near a water tower, where the lots were bigger and the trees older, and where there was a narrow strip of untended land between the last row of houses and the fence line. She had been there before. The tree was heavy with fruit in summer, and no one bothered about it, because the area around it was a little unkempt, and most families didn't let their kids wander over that far. Donna was reluctant. The sun was at its highest, and the middle of the day had a particular dead feeling to it that she always found unpleasant.
She said they should wait until after lunch, when it was a little cooler and a little later. Claire overruled her and they walked over together.
The mulberry tree was exactly where Claire had described it. Enormous, old, its branches drooping with dark fruit, standing alone in the rough strip of land between the houses and the fence, near a large flat rock that had been there so long the grass had grown over most of it. They climbed and picked, or rather, Claire climbed. Donna stood below and held the bag. It was hot and still, and the sound of the neighborhood, the distant lawnmowers, and the occasional car all felt very far away. Donna felt something brush her shoulder, a very light touch, like a warm hand barely making contact, and she turned and there was nothing behind her. She asked Claire if she had felt anything. Claire said no. She said it was probably just the leaves. Donna thought about it for a moment and then decided Claire was probably right. They brought the berries home, split them at the kitchen table with salt and a little vinegar the way their grandmother had shown them, and ate them and talked, and had a perfectly ordinary afternoon. The change began that same evening. By the time Donna walked home for dinner, Claire had already gone quiet in a way that Donna noticed but couldn't explain. Not upset, quiet, not tired, quiet, just absent, like the part of Claire that made her herself had stepped back slightly and left the shell to manage on its own. Donna checked in on her the next day and Claire was worse. She sat in the living room and stared at the middle distance and didn't initiate any conversation. When Donna spoke to her, she responded, but slowly, with a fraction of a second's delay that felt wrong. Like watching a video where the audio is very slightly out of sync. Her eyes looked different, not in a specific describable way, just wrong somehow. The day after that, Claire sat under the oak tree in her front yard all afternoon. She sat with her knees pulled to her chest and her chin on her knees, and she looked up at the sky repeatedly and then looked back down. And her expression was one that Donna could not name. Not sad, not vacant, more like listening. Donna went home and told her grandmother everything, including the tree and the touch on her shoulder. Her grandmother went very still when Donna described the tree. Donna's grandmother went to their church minister that evening, and the minister came to Claire's family home the next day. Claire's parents, initially skeptical, allowed it because they had no better explanation for what was happening with their daughter. The minister spent about an hour in the house. He came out and spoke quietly with Claire's parents, and then came to find Donna and asked her to describe exactly what had happened at the tree. Donna told him everything she could remember, including the touch. The minister nodded. He said he believed the tree had been in that location for a very long time, and that the ground around it had, over many years, accumulated a kind of presence that was associated with the particular quality of that place. The stillness, the age, the fact that no one really tended it. He said that what had touched Donna was likely a warning, a simple contact that was intended to communicate that this was occupied territory. He said Donna had been smart enough, instinctively, to take it seriously. He said Claire had not. He said climbing the tree, particularly in the middle of the day when that kind of presence is at its most concentrated, and taking the fruit was the equivalent of walking into a stranger's house and eating their food. It wasn't the destruction of the shrine Marcus had done, it was quieter than that. But it was still a violation, and the thing that lived there had decided to follow the violation back to its source. The minister worked with Claire that afternoon. Donna was not in the room. She waited on the porch with Claire's older sister and listened. At one point, there was a period of several minutes where Claire's voice came through the walls of the house in a tone that was not hers at all, lower and rougher, saying with considerable force that it was not going anywhere and that the minister had no idea what he was dealing with. The minister's voice, calm and unhurried, replied that he thought he had a reasonable idea. After a while, the house went quiet. Then normal sounds resumed. Dishes, ATV, someone walking down the stairs. The minister came out and sat on the porch and told Donna that Claire would be all right. She said she should sleep well tonight, and by morning she would be herself. He was right. Claire remembered nothing from the afternoon at the tree until the moment she woke up the morning after the minister's visit. As far as her own experience was concerned, she had simply fallen asleep one afternoon and woken up the next morning feeling slightly groggy and strange, but otherwise fine. When Donna told her what had happened over the past several days, Claire listened with an expression of polite disbelief that slowly changed as the details accumulated, until she was sitting very still and very pale and clearly, going back through her own memory, looking for something she had lost. She told Donna that she remembered the tree, she remembered climbing it, she remembered the heat, and she said she remembered just before she had started climbing, a feeling, not a sound or a sight, just a feeling, like the air around the tree had shifted slightly and pointed itself at her, a focused and deliberate attention from something she could not see.
She had climbed anyway because she was 15 and she had decided it was just her imagination. She said that to Donna with a flat and sober expression that Donna recognized as the look of someone who has just permanently updated something they believed about the world.
They walked past that tree a few times over the following years. They always crossed to the other side of the road when they did. Nothing unusual ever happened again. The tree is still there. Donna told us she drove past it on a visit back to Savannah 2 years ago, and it still has that same quality, that same concentrated stillness in the air around it. She did not slow down. She said some things have their places and their arrangements and the correct response when you encounter. One is simply to go a different way. The last story tonight is the longest. It is also, in some ways, the most disturbing. Not because of the supernatural events in it, though there are plenty of those, but because of what happens to a man who starts out good, who genuinely tries to do the right thing, and who is slowly and methodically dismantled by something that understood his weaknesses better than he did.
This story was submitted by a listener in the UK who grew up hearing it from his family. The man it is about is real. His name has been changed. He is still alive. He is not fully recovered. In a small rural community in the English countryside, about 40 miles outside of Birmingham, there was a lay minister named Thomas Halley. He was not a formally ordained minister.
He had no theological degree and no church of his own, but he had grown up in the community, the son of a deeply devout family, and he had from a young age shown a particular gift for the kind of ministry that most churches quietly acknowledge but rarely discuss openly: the ministry of dealing with things that should not be there. By his mid-30s, Thomas had an informal reputation throughout the surrounding villages. Families called him when they had problems that the regular clergy deflected. He would come, he would work, and he would leave the house quieter than he had found it. He charged nothing. He asked nothing. He was, by every account, a genuinely good man. He was also, underneath the genuine goodness, beginning to become something else. The success had started to shape him in ways he wasn't aware of. He had stopped praying about cases the way he used to. He had stopped consulting anyone. He had stopped feeling afraid, which sounds like a good thing but is not, because in this kind of work, a healthy fear is the thing that keeps you careful.
He had become, as one old woman in the community described him, a man who had forgotten that the shield belonged to someone else.
It started when a man named Victor came to see Thomas. Victor was a farmer who lived outside the village, and he had a son, 17 years old, named Owen, who had been behaving in increasingly disturbing ways for several months. Victor described the symptoms, and Thomas recognized them immediately. The sleeplessness, the strange speech, the apparent awareness of things no one else could perceive. He had handled cases like this before.
What Victor mentioned at the end, almost as an afterthought, was that 5 other people had already tried to help Owen, and every one of them had backed out after meeting the boy. Thomas drove out to Victor's farm that same evening. Owen was sitting in the kitchen when Thomas arrived. He looked up with a smile that Thomas later described as perfectly calibrated, the exact expression most calculated to seem harmless while communicating. Something underneath it that was the opposite of harmless.
Owen asked Thomas how many cases he had dealt with in his life. Thomas said he had lost count. Owen said that was interesting. He said he himself had many names, many histories, many contexts. He said Thomas had already met him somewhere along the line, even if Thomas didn't remember it. Thomas started to work. Owen immediately demonstrated that he was aware of the internal prayer, which stopped Thomas cold for a moment. Owen filled the silence with a quiet, detailed offer. He said Thomas didn't need to fight. He said the dark never slept. That was its advantage, and the way to be on the winning side was simply to stop sleeping. 7 days. That was all it took.
Thomas pressed on. Owen bit him on the hand hard enough to require a bandage afterward. Thomas stepped out of the room and asked Victor how long this had been going on. Victor said since early spring. It was now late September.
Thomas went home. On the way, a deer walked out of the hedgerow into the beam of his headlights, stopped, looked directly at his car for an extended and peculiar moment, and then went back into the hedge. That night a fire started in a hay storage outbuilding on his brother's property. His nephew was in a minor road accident. Thomas sat in his kitchen until 2 a.m. Thomas should have stopped. He didn't. He went back to the farm. He worked hard and came close to real progress, and then Victor pulled him off because it looked, from the outside, like Thomas was hurting Owen rather than helping him. Thomas left without finishing. Owen called after him from upstairs that he would feel the results. What followed over the next months was systematic. Something used Thomas's face and voice to tell his children untrue things. A figure was seen in a location that Thomas could not have been. A story spread through the village that Thomas had been violent with his wife. Thomas began losing track of time, forgetting conversations, misplacing scripture he had known for 20 years. His hair thinned, his teeth ached, his sleep became a place he did not want to go. On one particularly bad night, Thomas woke in the small hours to find his bedroom had changed in a way he could not explain. The walls were in the wrong places, the sounds were wrong. He heard a voice directing him toward something, and he turned toward it, and he screamed, and he does not remember what happened next. His youngest daughter found him. And here is the part of the story that Thomas could not have known until much later. His youngest daughter, who was 16, had been the center of this the whole time. She had been the staging point. The entity had established itself in her bedroom months before any of the other incidents began, and it had stayed there, invisible, using her room as its base of operations while it worked on her father from a comfortable distance. She had not told anyone because she thought she was dreaming. She thought it was just shadows and imagination. She was 16 and she was trying very hard not to be a problem. By the time the truth came out, the entity had come very close to completing what it had come to do. It was a retired minister named Robert, a man in his late 70s who had known Thomas's family for decades, who finally got through to Thomas's son and convinced the family to accept outside help. Robert drove 3 hours to reach them. He arrived without announcement at 7 in the morning and walked through the house room by room with the careful attention of someone who has done this many times and has never once been casual about it.
Robert worked for 4 days. During those 4 days, he identified several things that Thomas had not known. The entity that was present was not external in the way Thomas had assumed. It was connected to something Thomas himself had been carrying for years.
A long time ago, early in his ministry work, Thomas had used an old technique that he had learned from a book rather than from a person. A technique that involved establishing a kind of cooperative relationship with a secondary spiritual entity that would assist in the work. It was a practice that looked harmless on its surface and had undeniable results. The entity it summoned was real, and it helped, and Thomas had used it many times without examining what it was or what it wanted in return. When Thomas had encountered Owen, and the thing inside Owen had recognized Thomas's assistant, a confrontation had occurred that Thomas had not perceived. His assistant had defected. Or perhaps, Robert said carefully, it had never been on Thomas's side in the first place, and had only been waiting for an opportunity. The thing that had come home with Thomas from the farm and the thing he had believed was his ally were the same thing, had always been the same thing. It had known Thomas in a way that no external enemy could have known him. That was why the attacks were so precisely designed. That was why they worked.
Robert addressed this directly on the 3rd day of his work. At a point during the afternoon, Thomas's daughter's bedroom door opened on its own, and a voice came from inside the empty room that sounded exactly like Thomas, using information that only Thomas and Robert would have known, trying to redirect Robert's attention and break his concentration. Robert continued what he was doing without pausing. He said, still working, that it was a good try, and he had been expecting something like it.
On the 4th day, near midday, a pressure moved through the house from front to back, like a current, like something very large passing through walls. When it was gone, the air in the house felt different in the way that air feels after a long storm has finally moved on. Thomas's daughter came to the doorway of the room where Robert was sitting. She said she needed to tell him about the corner of her bedroom. She described in precise detail what had been there. Robert listened and nodded and thanked her and told her she was braver than she knew.
Thomas himself, when he was told the full account of what had happened to him and how, did not speak for a very long time. When he did speak, he said he had known for years something had felt not quite right about the assistance he received. He said he had made a choice not to look at it too closely because it worked, and because what works, he had told himself, must be what is right. Robert told him that was the oldest mistake in the ministry, and that he was far from the first person to make it.
Thomas Haley is still in the village. He still does some community ministry, quieter than before, with much more caution and much more consultation. He no longer works alone on anything that goes beyond a straightforward house blessing. He tells people plainly now when something is beyond his ability, which is something he had not said in over 15 years. His daughter is 22 now. She is studying to become a counselor. She told her father recently that she does not hold any of it against him, that she knows he did not know, that she knows he was trying, in his imperfect and prideful way, to do good work. Thomas apparently wept when she said this. His youngest daughter's room, the room that was used as a staging ground for months, was repainted and refurnished completely. She picked the colors herself. She has a great deal of natural light in there now, and plants. And she says she has never felt anything unusual in it since the morning after Robert's 4th day. Robert himself declined any acknowledgement of any kind. He drove the 3 hours home, called to confirm he had arrived safely, and that was the last contact. Thomas tried several times over the following year to reach out, to express his gratitude. Robert's response, when he responded at all, was simply that Thomas should take care of himself, and that the thanks, in this kind of work, always belong somewhere other than with the person doing it. Which, if you have been listening to these stories carefully tonight, is really the through line of all of them. The preacher who challenged the dark, the student who broke the shrine, the grandmother in the yard, the girl in the mulberry tree, the minister on the hollow road. In every case, the problem was the same in its simplest form. Someone stopped paying attention to something that required attention. Someone decided that what they couldn't see wasn't real, or didn't matter, or could be ignored, or could be handled alone. The dark does not argue with you when you make that decision. It just waits. It is very good at waiting. It has been doing it for a very long time.
The SpiritVox. It's alive.
That is 5 stories for tonight, all of them real. All of them submitted by people who wanted them told, who believed there was something useful in the telling. We honor that. We take it seriously. If you have a story of your own, something you have been carrying for a while, something that happened to you, or someone close to you that you cannot explain, we want to hear it. You can find our contact information in the description below. You can remain anonymous. You can choose how much or how little you share. We will treat it with care. If tonight's stories kept you awake, we consider that a sign that we did our job. The world is fuller than most of us are comfortable admitting. These stories are not entertainment, not really. They are reports from the edge of what we understand. And the edge is closer than you think. Stay safe out there, check your corners, lock your doors, and we will see you next time on the SpiritVox.